Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this presentation on Know Your Rights, during which we're going to be reviewing some important constitutional protections as they can be applied to encounters with components of immigration enforcement. Uh, we get started here with a review of our agenda. I'd like to begin by introducing myself. My name is Patrick Martinez, and I'm a staff attorney with the UFW Foundation. And I'm accompanied today by Evelyn Glynn. Evelyn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And my name is Evelyn. I work alongside with Patrick Martinez. I'm also a staff attorney.
And so, reviewing our agenda for today, we get started with a consideration of what are the several immigration enforcement agencies that a person would deal with, wherein they would have to apply or try to take advantage of what are their constitutional protections. We'll discuss what are the functions of those agencies. Then we're going to turn to those constitutional protections. Where exactly do they come from in the Constitution? What sort of rights and protections do they provide to an individual, and who is able to take advantage of those constitutional protections? Then, given that it is the case that you could encounter a immigration enforcement officer in different situations, in different contexts, we're going to look into what those constitutional protections look like when you apply them in different contexts. Then we're going to turn to important resources, information, and materials that being proactive you'd want to develop in anticipation of a possible encounter with immigration enforcement officers. We're going to turn to immigration enforcement such as it's handled at this moment in time that we are under a new presidential administration. Then we're going to finally turn to a review of the UFW Foundation services, how you can schedule an appointment, what sort of services are being offered at this moment, and finally would conclude with a section where we will be reviewing your questions and providing you some answers to those. So we get started with a review of important immigration agencies and their functions. At this moment in time, the two important immigration agencies that handle immigration enforcement, they are going to be found under the Department of Homeland Security, a federal department, which is a part of the federal government. And these immigration agencies are tasked with handling matters that in some ways overlap, but do pertain to distinct areas of immigration enforcement, beginning with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE. ICE is responsible for immigration enforcement and customs enforcement within the continental US. So they enforce federal laws that pertain to border control, to customs enforcement, to trade and immigration. For its part, Customs and Border Protection, also known as CBP, what they do is they administer customs and border protection at a border, and that can also be considered to be within 100 miles of a border. And we're not just talking about the borders that exist in between Mexico and the United States, Canada and the United States, but you can find a international border in different areas along the coast of the continental United States at an international airport where people are arriving from other countries. And so Customs and Border Protection is responsible for matters pertaining to customs, to border protection, to immigration at those areas. And although we've identified that these are the immigration agencies that a person might encounter as part of an immigration enforcement issue, it is also important to remember that sometimes immigration enforcement agencies are collaborating with state components, components of the state government in which a person may live under. Uh, Police departments sometimes collaborate or have agreements to work with components of immigration enforcement. So it's important to remember that in dealing with a local police department, that is a matter where a person may want to apply their constitutional protections and rights in order to protect themselves from something that ultimately may become an immigration enforcement issue as well because of some of the information or uh, the activities that are carried out as part of those contacts. And so we've identified what are the immigration agencies, the components of the state government and the federal government that a person may want to exercise their constitutional protections against in the context of of immigration enforcement. And now what we turn to is a review of, well, where do those constitutional protections come from? What specific constitutional protections are we talking about, and what do those provide to individuals? So the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States, known as the Bill of Rights, they provide limits to the power of the federal government and provide protections to the inhabitants of the United States. And those constitutional protections, they don't just protect people and provide rights to people that have the immigration status of a citizen. They are constitutional protections that in some cases apply to individuals and can be exercised by individuals regardless of their immigration status, and in areas of immigration enforcement. These constitutional protections, although they're enumerated in the Constitution of the United States, they've been expanded upon and further explained uh, through decisions made in courts, through laws passed by the federal government. And it's important to remember that because the way these constitutional protections have been further explained through cases decided in courts or legislation that has been passed by Congress, these are also protections that apply to state governments, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in just a moment. But important to remember that these constitutional protections, if not respected by the component of federal government or state government that a person is dealing with, that there are consequences uh, that those particular components may have to deal with. For example, any measure that they take against a person that is in violation of that person's constitutional rights uh, potentially could be challenged and stopped by a court. It is also possible to submit a complaint within the department or the organization that that particular law enforcement or immigration enforcement officer may be a part of. It's also in some cases possible to file civil suits, to sue someone in a civil case where there are monetary damages involved. It's also possible as part of an ongoing case in a court to take legal action against some of the information or some of the items that the government may try to present against an individual because they were obtained without respecting the person's constitutional rights. And so, turning to more specifically, where do these constitutional protections come from, and what exactly do they provide to individuals? Uh, we get started with the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment provides protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. A person cannot be arrested or searched without a warrant that is predicated on probable cause. And these Fourth Amendment protections, we're taking them into account in the context of questioning or arrests or searches by immigration enforcement or by law enforcement. And the way in which the Fourth Amendment applies and can be exercised, the rights of the Fourth Amendment can be exercised, they do vary by context, and we'll look into that a little bit more when we discuss constitutional protections in particular contexts. But it's important to remember that regardless of the context, it's necessary that immigration enforcement officers or law enforcement officers that they take actions that are reasonable, and if they do infringe on a person's constitutional protections or rights, that action have some justification. Otherwise, it's not going to be lawful. And turning to the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, this provides us protections such as the right to silence, which is a right that means that a person cannot be compelled to speak in encounters with enforcement, immigration enforcement, law enforcement. And that means also that if a person is silent as part of those encounters, that silence cannot be used against them. But important to remember as well that it's not just necessary to keep completely quiet. It's important to identify that a person is going to be exercising that right to silence. The Fifth Amendment also provides procedural guarantees. A person can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process. A person cannot be forced to testify against himself in a proceeding that involves criminal law, and uh, it's not lawful to unjustly detain or mistreat a person while they're in detention. under the protections that the Fifth Amendment provides. And then finally, we turn to the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is important because of the equal protection that it provides. The equal protections mean that a person cannot be treated differently under the law if they are similarly situated as other individuals. A person cannot be discriminated against on the basis of their race or their ethnicity. And another important component of the 14th Amendment is the incorporation doctrine, which means that the protections and the rights that are enumerated in those first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, that those also apply to state government, which is an important prospect, which is an important development because there are sometimes encounters with local law enforcement that may lead to issues of immigration enforcement because of collaboration with immigration enforcement. And so it's important that we also have access to these constitutional protections in those contexts and that we exercise them in those contexts. And so we turn next to the exercise of constitutional protections in specific contexts. And we get started with exercising constitutional protections in your home. The home is a place where, well, a person has a heightened expectation of privacy. It's a place where the most constitutional protections are held because of the place that a person's home holds in their life. And so whenever an immigration enforcement or a law enforcement officer presents themselves at a person's home, there are limited ways in which they can enter. There are exceptions to constitutional protections, and one of these important exceptions is that a person consents to an officer entering their home. So it's important to know that if a law enforcement officer does not have a warrant which has been signed by a judge which allows them to enter the home, then a person does not have to provide consent when an officer asks for that. And so important to remember that without a valid court order and without the person's permission, a member of immigration enforcement or law enforcement cannot be entering the home. And so whenever one of these officers presents themselves, it's important to remember to not open the door, to ask for that individual's identification. And if they do wish to enter, that they be asked to present a court order that has been signed by a judge. And even in this context, we can avail ourselves of Fifth Amendment protections and exercise our right to remain silent. And so important to remember that whenever a member of immigration enforcement appears at a person's home, that if they do want to enter by way of a court order, that we identify that the document that is being presented by that individual is a court order that would allow an immigration enforcement officer to enter the home. And so here on your screen, you will see a court order that has in fact been signed by a judge and is a valid warrant. But on this next page, we see a warrant that can be prepared by a member of an immigration agency, and it is not signed by a judge. It's just signed by a member of an immigration agency, an officer of an immigration agency. And so this is not sufficient in order to be able to enter a person's home. And so if an order such as the one on your screen is presented, this is not something that has been signed by a judge, and so it does not grant that immigration officer the authority to enter your home without permission. And it's not just at home where a person might encounter immigration officials or law enforcement officials. It's also sometimes possible to encounter those individuals at work. And when a person is at work, the only way in which a law enforcement officer, enforcement officer can enter those areas is by permission of the employer or through a valid court order. Once again, a place of employment can be a context where there are public areas. For example, if a person works in a convenience store, there are areas of that convenience store where the public can enter, but there are also private areas. And in order to be able to enter those private areas, it's necessary that there be permission or that there be a valid order that grants officials the power to enter in those particular areas. And if an officer is encountered in such a context, it's important to remember to not panic, to not run, if necessary, to exercise the right to remain silent, and to not to interfere with the activities of those officials, which could create additional issues. And being proactive, remembering that this is always a possibility, it's important to make emergency plans and to prepare certain types of documentation and information in anticipation to a potential encounter with immigration enforcement officers. And in a few moments, we'll talk a little bit more about what sort of materials or information a person might want to prepare, being proactive, given the possibility of encounters with enforcement officials. And we turn here to another context, encountering members of immigration enforcement or law enforcement in public. If someone like that is encountered in public, it's important to not run, to keep calm, and if necessary, to exercise one's right to remain silent. And important to remember, as mentioned before, that whenever a member of immigration enforcement or law enforcement is hoping to interact with a private person, that it's necessary to have some justification, that that action be reasonable. And so a person cannot just be stopped and held because an officer makes a decision to do that. They need to present certain types of justification. And so in some cases, an officer may approach a person and ask for certain information from that individual. And so in such a situation, if there isn't sufficient justification for the officer to be stopping the person, it is important for that person to ask if they are in fact free to go. And if they are, then to depart thereafter. There are in some states laws, statutes that allow officers to ask a person for identification. If an officer is using that state law to ask for identification, it is necessary to present identification. But if a person lives in a state where that is not a law, and an officer asks for identification, it's not necessary to comply. It is possible to refuse. It is possible to ask if the person is free to go. And in some cases, a person is going to be out in their car and may encounter a member of immigration enforcement or a member of law enforcement. And if a person is encountered in these contexts, it's important to share identifying information such as a license, proof of insurance, or registration. The car is a different place to the home, a place where there are less protections than in the home, given that a car is a place where the person is going to be out in public. And in this case, even though a person is out in public and is a context where there are less protections, it's still possible under the constitutional protections that are accorded by the Fourth Amendment for a person to refuse a search of the car unless they provide consent or unless the officer has a warrant that is granting them the power to search a person's car. And so again, once again, in this context, it's important to remember that a officers' powers are limited by the lack of an order or if a person does not provide them consent to move forward with a search of the vehicle. And then in some cases, unfortunately, a person will ultimately end up in custody. When a person is in custody, it's important to remember that given the applicable constitutional protections, they have the right to keep quiet, to make a phone call, to speak to a lawyer, to refuse to sign any documents that a immigration enforcement officer or a law enforcement officer may want to ask them to sign. And important in this context to remember that any information related to immigration status, that it only be disclosed to a person's lawyer and not anyone having to do with an immigration agency or law enforcement agency, because items such as, or issues such as arrests, charges, or convictions, these can have important consequences on a person's immigration status, their ability to defend themselves from certain charges related to immigration status. And in some cases, after being in custody uh, or before, a person may end up in detention. And in this context, it's also a place where a person can take avail of constitutional protections and exercise their right to remain silent, uh, right to speak to a representative, to make a phone call, to speak to the consulate of their country of origin. And important to remember that in this context, they are also not obligated to sign any document that is presented to them, and to first ask to speak with their representative and only speak with that representative pertaining to issues that uh, are dealing with that individual's immigration status. And completing this review of constitutional protections as they apply in particular context, now we turn to a review of important materials and information that a person being proactive may want to prepare in anticipation for a encounter with immigration enforcement or law enforcement officers.
Thank you, Patrick. And hi, this is Evelyn again, and I will be your presenter for the remainder of the presentation. So now we turn to a different to segue to a different segment of our presentation to discuss what are the important measures you or your family member could take in the event that you or your family member is detained or facing imminent immigration processing, especially if you have minor children. So in this slide, we have outlined a preparedness plan where you or your family, when you or your family is detained or is facing immigration proceedings, specifically in regards to collection of important documents related to your identity, biographic information, medical histories, child care contact and preference, financial statements, even business card of your attorney or legal representative. We would also recommend that you discuss with your family member ahead of time in regards to a immediate plan and long-term plan, and under the situation. And also having a child care plan is critical if you have minor children and no adult family member is available. So for your children, for your child care plan, a designated adult should be identified. His or her contact information should be included. And of course, the person should have advanced knowledge of his or her responsibility and also would consent to take on this responsibility. So important documents related to your children should be kept along with the rest of your family's important documents. Ultimately, you will decide on the course of action for the children to whether to return to your home country or stay in the U.S. if you are ordered to leave the U.S. and have to return home. Next slide. Thank you. And there are also additional measures that you can consider, essentially by delegating another person to manage your affairs and take care of your children. And here we have identified 3 measures that are legally binding. First of all, guardianship, then power of attorney, followed by a caregiver authorization affidavit. So through a guardianship, and that would be that would require a court order. The court would authorize an appointed guardian with legal and physical custody of your children without you having to relinquish your parental rights. This guardian can make decision on your behalf, and you can later terminate this guardianship with the court. Through the power of attorney, it is a legal document that can authorize another to act on your behalf on specific matters or general affairs Most commonly, the power of attorney is used to delegate financial affairs. Lastly, you could also execute a caregiver authorization affidavit. And the affidavit allows you to designate a caregiver to make certain school and medical decisions for your children in the state of California. You will give this document to your child's school contact and/or healthcare provider. It does not affect your custody of the children in any way. The general criteria would be individuals such as a family member or extended family member, a relative or a close friend who's over the age of 18 with lawful status, which would be ideal, but not required. And the individual would have to sign on the day that it's set to take effect. The affidavit has a duration of 1 year. Next slide. Another important document would be here, the red card. It was discussed previously. We recommend that you carry this card and be ready to present it to enforcement officers to exercise your constitutional rights. And on the right-hand side, this is a list of common documents that you would include in your family preparedness binder or a compilation of important documents. Next slide. Now we turn to the immigration enforcement under the current administration. So in this last segment, we want to provide you with an update with immigration enforcement under the Biden administration. First, we look at changes at the border. Changes under the Biden administration include the lift of a Muslim ban, a halt on the construction of the border wall, and the migrant protection protocols. President Biden has developed strategies to address causes of migration from the Northern Triangle, countries including Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, in the effort to manage the migratory flow and to review all asylum policies for domestic violence and gang violence. In the aspect of immigration enforcement, next slide, please. The administration has organized special task force to reunite families, institute guidelines to effect fewer arrests and deportations. And the 100-day moratorium of deportation has been suspended indefinitely by the federal court. And also the removal of the public charge rule for those who are seeking to adjust their status to gain lawful permanent residency. And this will conclude our Know Your Rights presentation. And yes, as always, we want to remind you to utilize our service. Since March, we started a Q&A session that is scheduled for every fourth Wednesday morning from 10 to 10:30. So our next upcoming Q&A session will be on March 28th. So we invite you to drop by if you just have a simple question or want to know what the UFW Foundation is working on in other aspects to empower our community members. And for more personalized consultation, please schedule an appointment through our campus portal. Next slide. Or the UFW Foundation webpage under Community Colleges Project, or simply give us a call at our regional office in Oxnard. Thank you. And for the remainder of our time, we will answer questions posted in the chat box. And here are sorry, go back. Right, so and here are the contact numbers for our other regional offices, including Salinas, Fresno, and Bakersfield. And thank you for joining us. No question.